Tonight on Politicat, a look back at Iowa, who sits atop the latest polls and who is out of the race. Also a look at the New Hampshire primary and what all the numbers really mean. It's a political party on Politicat, and it begins now. It was the 2016 shuffle in Iowa Monday as Ted Cruz and Hillary Clinton come out on top. I'm Jesse Kirsch, joined by former College Democrats President Quentin Heilbronner and former College Republicans President Dominic Burke. Gentlemen, thank you for being here as always. We've got a lot to talk about surrounding the Iowa caucus and what played out in the Hawkeye State on Monday. You might wonder if they are still counting the Democratic votes in Iowa after former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton barely sneaks by Senator Bernie Sanders. They were still counting votes on Tuesday morning, and you can see there just how close it was. Quentin, when we take a look at this, barely even 0.3 percentage points of a margin there. Did the way that the Democrats caucus and that they gather, they throw their support behind other candidates if things don't go their way, do you think that played into how close this actually came out to be?
Certainly to a degree. It penalizes candidates who have less support. You know, Martin O'Malley was polling at about 4 or 5% in the state of Iowa. He got 0.6% of statewide delegates in the end. And you saw the same thing in 2008. Bill Richardson, Joe Biden, remember him, Chris Dodd, all were polling at least within some respectable margin, all got virtually nothing because the Democrats have a system where you have to get 15% of all the participants in a caucus to even be viable. And a candidate like O'Malley with 5–10% of support in the state can't quite reach that viability threshold, and it throws the field into chaos when his supporters suddenly have to go towards their second choice.
And we talked about how you mentioned Senator O'Malley, or former Governor O'Malley rather, having not enough support come out, but there was a lot of turnout, and that definitely played into this as well.
It definitely did. You know, Senator Sanders overperformed his polling numbers by a significant degree. And a lot of that is younger voters, college-age kids, who are coming out to support Senator Sanders in a way that they didn't even support Senator Obama in 2008. Bernie Sanders got a percentage of the youth vote in the 2016 caucuses that dwarfs Obama's already impressive performance with young Democrats in 2008.
And then in the Republican field, it was Cruz and Trump and someone you might not have guessed 6 months ago. We're talking about, of course, Florida Senator Marco Rubio with the third place finish. And then you have Chris Christie, John Kasich, and Jeb Bush all finishing with less than 3% of the vote. So the Florida senator now appears to be the establishment candidate to beat. But Dominic, that may not actually be the case.
Well, it's interesting, Jesse, because if you had looked 6 months ago, a year ago, no one would have called Marco Rubio an establishment candidate. Last time I was on this program with Quentin was February of last year, and we spent the entire episode talking about Jeb Bush, talking about how Jeb was the presumptive nominee, the only establishment Republican in the field who seemed like a feasible nominee. Now you had Jeb Bush coming in at about half of what he was polling at prior to the primary, and it certainly looks like Marco Rubio is starting to get the establishment vote even sooner than a lot of us expected.
And when we move into New Hampshire, which is coming up on Tuesday, things are very interesting on both sides of this, but keeping with Marco Rubio for the moment, he came across as the establishment candidate to some of the people who voted for him probably. That's definitely how it's starting to be spun in the media, but we talked about this before going on the air, and this may not actually be how he comes out after the New Hampshire primary. So this is very pivotal for how his reputation looks the rest of the way, isn't it?
Oh, I think it is, and I think it's important to remember, too, that New Hampshire and Iowa, the differences in these two states. Yet if you look at the polling numbers going into both of them, they appear very similar, not in perhaps height, but in perhaps standings of candidates, with Trump at the top, followed by Cruz, followed by Rubio, and then a block of establishment candidates.
What do you make of the Rick Santorum endorsement for Senator Rubio, Quentin? Not necessarily someone who people would probably say is an establishment candidate, so does that taint the reputation he might be trying to build up?
Well, I personally was very surprised. I thought, Santorum was going to go for anybody. Huckabee would have been the first. Huckabee's out. It would have been Ted Cruz next. But that said, I think that the big endorsement, and there's nothing confirmed on this, is Mitt Romney. If Mitt Romney endorses Marco Rubio, as some people say that he might, others say that he won't, Romney has been sound on the issue, that would be a huge, huge sign that the Republican establishment has found their guy. Jeb Bush, and he announced he didn't have much fire in the belly. His campaign was awkward. He was a weak campaigner. He hadn't been in public office since 2006. Rubio's fresher, he's younger, he's charismatic, he's got an impressive fundraising ability considering he didn't even have his own state to fundraise in basically because of the Bush network. And if we see endorsements like Mitt Romney coming in for Marco Rubio, that more than somebody like Santorum is going to be the sign that he is the establishment's choice.
What do you make of that, Dominic? Because Mitt Romney has to be as establishment as an endorsement could come. And a lot of the people at the top of the polls for the GOP are trying to brand themselves as the complete opposite of that.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at those candidates, and we're talking frankly about Donald Trump and Ted Cruz for the most part, if you look at those candidates, certainly they're leading the Republican field. But there are questions about whether they have a majority of the Republican field or a plurality of the Republican field, and it's pretty clear that they don't have a true majority. Also, you look at second choice voters, where you have Donald Trump not doing well at all. Almost no voters who don't support Trump support him as a second choice candidate. You see kind of this idea that, well, maybe the rhetoric seems to be loud enough that these guys are popular, but I think the establishment is still there and strong in terms of the pragmatism of winning elections.
And it was, so a lot of exciting things coming out of Iowa, but it was not a great night for everyone in the 2016 field. For the Democrats, Martin O'Malley threw in the towel, and on the other side of things, for the Grand Old Party, candidates Rand Paul, Mike Huckabee, and Rick Santorum, as we previously mentioned, all dropped out. We saw Huckabee and Santorum campaigning for Donald Trump over the weekend. Gotta ask, was it over before it even began for a couple of these candidates?
Well, it's sure hard to believe if it was. You look at the two last winners in 2008 and 2012 of the Iowa caucus get close to 0% of the vote, causing them to drop out. It's interesting because you look at just how much politics has changed in this cycle from in the past, but also how the parties are kind of spreading themselves too thin to establish votes in other would have historically been very strong candidates.
And one interesting, just going back to that detail about how the Democrats and Republicans caucus differently, just to put it in perspective, Santorum and Huckabee both won the Iowa caucus in their respective, first time running. If the Republicans had the same 15% viability threshold that the Democrats had, they would have performed as badly as Martin O'Malley, and they had won the state just 1 or 2 cycles beforehand, which is just an incredible shift in the way that the Republican Party is choosing its candidates.
It's interesting that you bring up Iowa specifically because it has been a bit of a misnomer for what it means for the rest of the campaign. We were talking about this the other night, Dominic, how winning Iowa, especially for the Republicans, has not really bode well in the last 16 years. George W. Bush was the last Republican candidate to win Iowa and then go on to be the nominee and, of course, become the president. But it's a little bit different for the Democrats in recent memory. Of course, Barack Obama in 2008 coming up with a huge win. But it wasn't a landslide victory for Hillary Clinton. So how does she spin this as a big win, especially when you look at the fact that going into New Hampshire this upcoming week, she's down 2-1 against Bernie Sanders in some of the latest polls?
I mean, I think she spun it as well as she could, which is to say, not very well. It's definitely trouble for her campaign. She knows it. They've done a respectable job, I think, they declared victory prematurely, which on some level, frankly, was not a terrible idea, considering in the end they did win the state. But I think right now this is a sign to Hillary Clinton. She looks out to the nomination. She knows she is still the front runner in a large way. Bernie Sanders takes New Hampshire. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that he's going to win that state. There's the Nevada caucus afterwards. People don't pay attention to Nevada for whatever reason. She's still favored there. South Carolina, she's all but guaranteed in South Carolina. Sanders does not play well in the South. And then it's on to Super Tuesday, where states that are much, much more centrist, much, much more diverse than Iowa and New Hampshire, states almost perfectly demographically tailored for Sanders. Those states, there really aren't a lot of states like that on Super Tuesday. So Clinton knows that in the end, she is still the greatly favored nominee. The question is, can she do that without making Sanders voters feel like they're excluded from the Democratic coalition and without making it feel like the party has decided before voters get a chance to vote?
Dominic, what about from your perspective? How does the GOP see the way things turned out for the Democratic field? Is Bernie Sanders someone to take a lot more serious now?
I think this just shows how much trouble the Democratic Party is in, quite frankly. You had Hillary Clinton, who was leading by a vast majority. There was no way there was even going to be a challenge by an extremely far-left senator from Vermont who has very limited chance of winning in a general election. And now the Democratic voters, rational voters, look and say, oh my goodness, what's going on with Hillary Clinton? Can we really afford to nominate someone with this history and these problems? And they're saying, well, maybe we have to look over here, despite Sanders' potential problems with the general electorate.
Talk about some of the problems surrounding the Clinton campaign. Over the weekend, you saw that The State Department declared that they were not going to release a batch of some of the latest batch of her emails because they were actually classified as top secret after the fact. But all the same, a different line coming out of the State Department than we've heard with the rest of these. Is this something that her campaign has to actually worry about?
It is. I don't think it's something that her campaign has responded to adequately. And frankly, as a Democrat, it's been one of my issues for supporting Senator Clinton, Secretary Clinton. As I do, it's nonetheless certainly a problem for her campaign. And they need to find a way to become more aggressive and to have a more unified and frankly more effective message. She's already said the responsibility is with her. She made a mistake, and that's a good first step. But the fact that this story has stayed alive, I think, is a sign that her campaign has a whole lot more to do.
And then finally, just to kind of tie a bow on top of everything, there's, of course, a Democratic debate going on right now. There are plenty more to come on both sides of this campaign, but the polling that has determined how these debates have shaped up has not really been on top of its game this election cycle, has it?
Not in the slightest. You know, people have gotten Iowa very wrong. Even Ann Seltzer, the gold standard of Iowa polling, called Iowa for Mr. Trump, and Senator Cruz won it by a pretty comfortable margin, by 3 full percent, which is, impressively enough, the largest margin of victory for anybody in the Iowa caucuses since 2008.
Well, and not only that, you look at what happened in Iowa in terms of Jeb Bush and Chris Christie polling, coming in far lower than they polled. You look at what you've seen throughout the entire Republican primary cycle with debates being determined by polling and polling shifting, but debates not changing. There are a lot of very interesting things going on both sides of the aisle, but I can certainly speak to within the Republican kind of back rooms have seemed to have been having polling issues for several years now.
Well, plenty of exciting stuff going on around this campaign, as always with 2016, so we'll have plenty more coverage. Gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Continue to follow us on NNN for plenty of coverage of the 2016 campaign, and that'll do it for this edition of Politicat. For all of us here at NNN, I'm Jesse Kirsch saying thank you for watching. Go out and make it a good one.